this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
What was the situation in Burma following the Allied victories at Imphal and Kohima? By the summer of 1944, those two hard-fought battles had marked a major turning point in the Burma campaign. Japanese forces were in retreat, and the initiative had passed firmly to the Allies. But pushing into central Burma would require bold strategy, speed, and coordination across air, land, and river. I'm joined by Jack Bowsher, author of Thunder Run, Meiktila 1945. We're going to be discussing the dramatic and fast-paced Battle of Meiktila, a pivotal moment in the Allied drive south that contributed significantly to the conclusion of the Burma campaign. Welcome back, Jack. It's nice to see you again. Let's start by setting the scene. What was the situation in Burma following the Allied victories at Imphal and Kohima?
Yeah, so when Imphal and Kohima take place, obviously that's Slim's big battle where he defeats the Japanese attempted invasion of Burma. And the first sort of really, really important thing that Slim does is that instead of him doing the sort of, what they've done every previous year is they sit out the monsoon, they rebuild their army, take on new replacements are brought in, from the recruitment pools and so on. Refit the troops, new equipment, and all that sort of thing. After Imphal and Kohima, and just partway through the monsoon, Slim takes a decision, very brave one, to continue the fight and effectively break out from Imphal and Kohima. And he does this on two different routes, and that's basically just him just hedging his bets. One of those routes will maybe have an easier time, and therefore that's his route into Burma. Both of them will converge on this particular place on the River Chindwin called Kalewa, which is the crossing point back in 1942 when Slim's Burr Corps retreated in 1942, crossed at Kalewa as well. And it's just that really obvious point, this ferry, that there's relative for the Far East Theatre and for Burma in particular, there's some logistics, although they're going to have to build a proper road for an invasion. It's not complete wilderness as it had been 2 years earlier. So breaking out of Imphal, the Japanese obviously massively weakened after their failure to take Imphal and Kohima. The Road of Bones is the famous phrase, Fergal Keane's wonderful book on the Siege of Kohima, for example. That particular sort of description of it is really, really powerful because it's true. The Japanese don't just lose soldiers to combat, it's disease and starvation as well. And so as they're pushing out of Imphal, this is what they're discovering. And so Slim thinks, well, we may as well keep going. Instead of giving them 5-6 months to recover and wait till the end of the monsoon, we're just going to keep going. So the two routes out, the 11th East African Division go down the Kabul Valley. So if you're coming out of Imphal in a southeasterly direction, there's a town called Tamu. And then that goes southwards through the Kabul Valley. Tamu is sort of at the head of the Kabul Valley at that point anyway. And then they're going to appear at Kalewa, a couple hundred miles down the valley. And then over to slightly to the west, which is the direct southern route out of Imphal, straight line south. That's the Tidim Road. Now, the Tidim Road is a bit more mountainous, whereas if you go east to Tamu, south down the Kabul Valley, it's mountainous up to Tamu, but then it's a flat river valley down the Kabul Valley. Whereas if you go directly south out of Imphal, you're going with the mountainous terrain on the Tidim Road and the town of Tidim, which is about 100 miles south of Imphal. And then you go from Tidim, 100 miles south of Imphal, you then go east to Kalewa. So these two routes will converge at the same place. But by fighting through the monsoon, the Japanese won't be able to bring in any reinforcements. So logistically, it's a horrific nightmare for the soldiers fighting in this is the classic dripping jungle and platoon-sized actions, company-sized actions, ambushes and things like that. And the Japanese are fighting rear guards and delaying actions, but they're never going to get reinforced before the 11th East African Division, the 5th Indian Division that go down the Tidim Road, before they actually push them out. And that's the beauty of Slim's first decision here. I'm not going to wait out the monsoon. It's going to be a hell of a fight in monsoon conditions. But because the Japanese have been so weakened by their failure at Imphal and Kohima, they will be easier to push out now. If I wait until after the monsoon, these troops will be reinforced. And that's a massive problem because it's mountainous terrain, it's jungle, and it's thick jungle in the Kabul Valley. So strike them whilst they're weak now and get to the Chindwin in time for the dry season and then cross over into northern Burma.
So when you're crossing into northern Burma, they choose... Is it
Meiktila? Yeah.
Meiktila.
So Meiktila's not actually... It's further south than this. But remember, we're still talking about Operation Capital at this point. And Meiktila is not really in the plan yet.
I was struggling to sort of figure out where Capital started and stopped.
Yeah, shall I go through it? So,
yeah.
Operation Capital is the original planned invasion of Burma. And the important thing to remember about it is Slim is not invading Burma to take back territory for the sake of it. They do want to recapture Burma and the territory. But their plan to do that in Operation Capital is to destroy the Japanese in an area that is advantageous for Slim and disadvantageous for the new Japanese commander. So the previous Japanese commander has been sacked. So, for example, Mitsuguchi and so on, and has been replaced by Hataru Kimura. The assumption is that Kimura will fight tooth and nail on the northern part of the central plain of Burma. Now, the central plain of Burma is really important because the whole of Operation Capital is about getting onto the central plain of Burma. And because the Japanese will fight for every inch, because that's what they've done at every single battle in this entire war so far, they will destroy the Japanese on the central plain. And the reason they're confident in that is because they now have a proper combined arms ethos, but it's still kind of built around mountain tracks and jungles and small scale stuff. A troop of tanks here, a squadron here, that sort of thing. But they do have air power, artillery, tanks, and infantry working in unison. And in particular, it's that the armour is important because the Japanese have never developed their anti-tank capability. They were struggling to destroy Stuart tanks in 1942, and they are still using the same guns against Lee Grant's in 1944. And when we come to them, Sherman's in 1945. And so therefore, we're talking 2 generations of tank newer, and yet the Japanese have not advanced their anti-tank technology at all. Okay, this is still stuff that was embarrassed at Khalkhin Gol, even in 1939. So what you have then is Slim wants to get all of this combined arms idea onto the central plain of Burma on the northern side of the Irrawaddy. And that's important. So he wants to crush the Japanese on the northern part of the central plain between the Chindwin, which runs down one side of it, and the Irrawaddy, which runs down the far side of it, and sort of cuts across the middle of it, halfway down the central plain. So the northern part of the central plain is called the Shwibo Plain because of the town of Shwibo, sort of roughly in the middle of it. And then there's another bit of plain further south, the other side of the Irrawaddy, and Meiktila is there. And we'll park Meiktila for a moment because that's still not part of the plan. Because, again, Operation Capital, get onto the northern part of the central plain, use all your tanks, artillery, infantry, all that air power, destroy Kimura there. And once his army has been completely destroyed, we'll have an easy ride to Rangoon. And we'll get to Rangoon before the monsoon, because if we want to resupply an army in Burma, we can't do it through the monsoon over, nearly 1,000 miles back to Dimapur and Calcutta and so on. We can't rely on the roads and air power after May 1945. So if we invade Burma, it's, to use a quote from one of the guys that I talk about in my book, it is shit or bust for Rangoon. Once you invade Burma, you are all in. You cannot hesitate. And the thing that goes wrong, and the reason why you have Operation Capital and then Operation Extended Capital, is when they cross over the Chindwin River, and importantly, it's over the longest Bailey Bridge in the world at the time, 1,100 yards across, although it is superseded by the Canadians' Reese on the Rhine River.
I know, but 1,100 yards is close to a kilometre, isn't it?
Yeah. So
creeping up to, it's nuts.
It's an incredible feat. And again, there is footage of it that you can find on the IWM. It's called Grub Bridge because it's obviously going to have food on it. They do build others where it's narrower, but that first one is the longest one. And as they're breaking onto that northern part of the Shwibo Plain, and the 19th Indian Division, which is part of 4 Corps, is racing across the top of it, their job is to head straight for Mandalay, that romantic target. Everyone knows it from Rudyard Kipling, that former imperial capital and so on before the British were there. And so that seems like an obvious target. And the other parts, so 33 Corps, will clear the rest of the plain to the south of that and destroy Kimura where he is. That's the main plan that they have here. The trouble is Kimura has had an extensive period of time in Europe in the 1920s, 1930s. He understands the European war in a way that a lot of other Japanese commanders whose general interwar experience was in China, he understands the European way better, basically, than those China veterans who are now in high command. He does do the right thing, is he doesn't let his army get destroyed, crushed between the Irrawaddy River and the Chindwin River by these roving armoured columns, which is what Slim wants. Because, again, it's a plain, so it's very flat, no more jungle, lots of observable territory, lots of airfields as well, or potential for airfields as well. So Kimura withdraws behind the Irrawaddy in sort of January 1945. He doesn't fight the giant army battle that Slim was after. Remember, this has never been about territory. This is Nelsonian annihilation. I want to fix my enemy, destroy him, so that we can get to Rangoon really easily. That fails. Operation Capital does not succeed from the point of view of it didn't destroy the Japanese army as planned. But they did have some alternative plans that included the exploitation to get to Rangoon quickly, which had included the idea of sending an outflanking force down another valley to the west of the Irrawaddy, but still across the Chindwin. So when they came out of the Kabul Valley and crossed the Chindwin into the northern part of the Central Plain, there was an option to just go in a straight line continuing south. So instead of going across the Chindwin to the east, just carry on going south. The Chindwin will join the Irrawaddy, so they don't even need to cross the Chindwin on this route. And then you cross the Irrawaddy about 80 miles, 90 miles further south, where it's quite wide. And so kind of that was one of the things, well, we don't really want to cross the Irrawaddy if we can avoid it. We talk about the Rhine at 300 and something meters as being this formidable obstacle, going all the way up to Roman times. That's the boundary of the Roman Empire in that part of the world and all this sort of thing. The Rhine is 300 and something, 330 meters, I think it is, at Wesel, where the Rhineland crossing is. We're talking at nearly over a mile across in the dry season, and it's 6 miles in the wet. The Irrawaddy is it's 3 times wider, basically, than the Rhine, is kind of what I'm saying here. Give or take, about 3 times wider. And so they don't really want to cross the Irrawaddy if they can avoid it, especially if it's an opposed river crossing. But that is exactly what Kimura is now forcing Slim to do. And he's forcing Slim to do it on the cuff because they have plans to destroy him above the Irrawaddy to the north of it. And that's why you get Operation Extended Capital, because Kimura basically didn't conform to the plan. It's the classic thing, no plan survives the first contact. So Operation Extended Capital is in 2 weeks, they replan the idea to trap the Japanese and destroy them still in the Central Plain. Because again, the big worry for Slim is that even if they do get across the Irrawaddy, what if Kimura then retreats into the jungle of southern Burma and the Irrawaddy Delta? They'll be back in the same situation where really, really difficult to use the advantages of his air power in the jungle, difficult to use advantages of tanks in the jungle, and also, therefore, that prolongs the campaign because he loses a lot of his advantages, and then he doesn't make it. And then what if they're 600 miles into Burma, they're 200 miles short of Rangoon, and then the monsoon strikes? They might have to withdraw all the way back across the Chindwin because they can't supply an army there. And what if the Japanese then defeat what's in place? Slim has to make it to Rangoon, and so he has to destroy the Japanese on the Central Plain. So now it's a case of, well, how do I stop the Japanese, like Kimura, retreating into the jungles of southern Burma? Well, use that old idea. We will send a unit, because we're going to have to cross the Irrawaddy anyway. So the old idea that meant we would cross the Irrawaddy doesn't matter, that was the reason to rule it out the first time. We have to do it anyway, so we may as well dust that appreciation off. So what he does is he sends 4 corps down the Gangor Valley, which is just, like I said, if you're coming out the Kabul Valley, instead of turning east and going across the Chindwin into northern Central Plain, you just go straight south for another 80, 90 miles, and then you go east and then across the Irrawaddy 80, 90 miles further south. And what they'll do is they'll do that and then bump over the Irrawaddy and send a strike force to this town of Meiktila that they've identified, which they've bombed multiple times, going all the way back to 1943. It's been a bombing target because it is a logistical supply hub. Every single railway that comes out of both Thailand, so where the POWs take building the Death Railway, but also railways and roads coming up from Rangoon, where supplies have come in by the port. they pass through Meiktila and then fan out to where the Japanese fighting fronts are in both western and northern Burma, including the defenders of the Irrawaddy and Mandalay and so on. This is what's sometimes called Slim's masterstroke, which is a quote actually from Kimura himself. He describes it as thus. He sees Slim's game. He knows that Slim's an operator, and Kimura knows it. After the war, he realizes what he was up against. So he gives credit where it's due. It was a masterstroke. Because what Slim does is, instead of bouncing his divisions that were in 4 Corps already heading for Mandalay and sending them round, he reassigns them to 33rd Corps, which was clearing the rest of the northern plain. And he sends the rest of 4 Corps, which had been in reserve effectively. 19th Division was the only 4 Corps unit committed so far. So 4 Corps are going to go down that route down the Gangor Valley, because 33rd Corps already on the northern part of the Central Plain, 19th Division going there. And he will use that as part of his deception. The crucial thing about the whole thing is that by tricking the Japanese into thinking that Slim is heading for Mandalay, and don't get me wrong, that he is sending divisions there for that purpose, but the point of it is to draw the Japanese up to Mandalay and the gap in between Mandalay and Meiktila, which, like I said, will be captured. And Slim uses his favourite metaphor. He uses this about 3 times in Defeat into Victory. He's going to crush them between 33rd Corps' hammer and 4 Corps' anvil and Meiktila. He's going to crush them between the two things. And that's what Kimura calls the masterstroke, because, he's basically accepting that I fell for Slim's trick, hook, line, and sinker. I went for Mandalay, assumed it was the main crossing, instead of reinforcing further south, trapping the most of my army to the north of Meiktila. And it works very, very well, because not just the deception thing there, but things like, Slim sends 3 divisions to Mandalay, whereas only one of them crosses south at Meiktila. And so that looks like a feint, when actually it's the main effort. And there's all sorts of other deception operations. The RAF are dropping sort of dummy parachutists like they did at D-Day in various different places. They're doing what they call canned battle. So they drop canisters of fireworks that then go all this sort of stuff all over the place. They're doing all sorts of things. There's radio deception going on, everything. And also the command of the air that Slim has at this point means that the Japanese don't even realize that there's a corps making their way down a valley. And even then, the troops that are spearheading the advance down the Gangor Valley are independent Indian troops under what's called the Lashai Brigade. There are no British units involved, British officers, but there are no British battalions, no regular battalions from the British Army. They're all Indian. A lot of them are like hill tribesmen that have been organised into battalions. They are like the Chindits in a way. They're very lightly equipped. They don't really have any artillery and so on. But that's perfect for the deception, because, again, that doesn't look like the main effort to invade a country. If you're sending lightly equipped infantry-based forces, it just looks like something similar to the Chindits, a long-range penetration. But behind them is the 7th Indian Division and the 17th Indian Division and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade. So there's this almighty thunderbolt coming from behind this very well delivered sort of deception operation. And Slim's constantly fighting the urge. When the advance slows down a couple of times, he doesn't want to overdo the firepower, because that might give the game away that there's a lot of firepower there, which suggests a much bigger formation of soldiers coming their way.
Oh, so how much of a rush is it to Meiktila?
At this point, it's not too much of a rush, because the more important thing at this point is deception. There is a clock running because of the monsoon in May, but we're talking here. So the advance down the Gangor Valley is sort of December into January of 1945, and then they break out at the end at the end of January, and so they're at the banks of the Irrawaddy in February, and then they do the assault crossing on the 14th of February, which is an amazing operation.
What's funny about the crossing of the Irrawaddy, it's such an enormous river, and they've got deception plans. You're sort of thinking, this is all sounding like D-Day. But in the Far East, but we never hear about it because it's such an enormous river, body of water to cross, yet they don't quite have all that sort of same infrastructure and, to deliver that sort of amphibious operation.
In fairness, we probably shouldn't compare it to D-Day, but compare it to the Rhine crossing, because that's probably a fairer comparison. But they still don't have the logistics of either of those operations. That's actually really the key thing here. So, for example, forestry units making barges themselves. It's bailey bridges on pontoons. A thing I often liken it to is, this is the assault crossing to win the war in Burma. And it would have looked like the scene in, or at least a significant part of it, the infantry crossing in the initial waves, would have looked like the scene in A Bridge Too Far when they crossed the Vaal with the 82nd Airborne. It would be like that. And the first wave that goes at night travels silently using paddles for 2 miles. They give them an hour and a half to cross by paddle.
It's nuts. But whereas you look at the Rhine crossing, they're bringing forward landing craft. It's a different technological scale, if that makes sense.
For a 3 times narrower crossing. They're using, and LVT buffaloes, like you say, LCVPs are brought up on lorries and so forth. This is, like I said, it's canvas boats for the infantry. It's bailey bridges on pontoons and wooden barges made a month before or a couple of weeks before. Like, it's absolutely nuts. And it nearly goes wrong at the beginning as well. The beginning of the crossing is almost a bit of a dud, but they basically just force the crossing with firepower. They try to cross silently first and clear the beach, but it doesn't work. And so then the whole corps' artillery and tanks are brought up to the banks of the river and are firing, long range over the river, and they force the crossing in the end. And it is a success. But, at the very beginning, it's really quite a tense operation, but they do manage it.
Because the other thing that struck me was that you've got this opposed crossing that once you're across, you've got your Bailey Bridge, but that's such a funnel that you've got to get all your logistics over, that you've got to get, or even if you have a number of them, it's not like having a series of ports with, it's such a funnel that you've got to get everybody through. A tremendous amount of material to keep everything running.
The thing is, at this point, there isn't a Bailey Bridge across the Uri. It's just too wide for that. It's the Chindwin with the Bailey Bridge. The Uri, it is a ferried crossing for the entire campaign. It's only when they capture other bridges and repair the spans of the Ava Bridge up at Mandalay, for example, they actually have a proper bridge cross, and they bridge it further up where it's narrower, and other bridges are captured as well, that sort of thing. But they are massively relying on ferried supplies for most of this operation. So it's not even bridges. It's it's mind-boggling that they achieve it. But, the elephant in the room we haven't mentioned here was really air power, because that's actually the heart of the operation that follows, or the logistical heart of the operation.
Right, Jack, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment. Yes, so should we get to the Thunder Run? Is this a Far East Blitzkrieg? What's the Monty phrase? A dagger to the heart of the Rhine, or whatever that is. Is this that kind of operation where they're going, look, we won't worry about the flanks, just get to the objective?
Yes, yeah, absolutely right. And again, that's why air power is so important. So it absolutely is that. Meiktila, like I said, is that supply hub, that all of the roads and railways that leads to the fronts logistically for the Japanese pass through Meiktila. So that's why it's been identified as the target. Remember, just to remind listeners, what the point of all of this is to destroy Kimura on the relatively flat central plain, not take territory for the sake of it. So he's not going to capture Meiktila because he really wants to capture Meiktila. He's going to Meiktila because the Japanese will have to take it back. And so now the Japanese, who are crushed between Mandalay and Meiktila, attacking one of those two places, but in particular Meiktila, because the Japanese will not be able to retake Mandalay if they don't retake Meiktila. And so Slim will have, instead of having all these worries about, Kimura retreating his army into the jungles of southern Burma, now all of a sudden the Japanese are going to come to him. So he's going to have his army-sized battle, his Clausewitzian or the Napoleonic final battle. He'll have his Waterloo and all that, all this sorts that you're using all of these cliches. He will have those things, the dagger to the heart, the thunder rod, whatever, however you want to describe it. Slim will have his battle. Kimura won't be able to weasel out of it unless he gives up Burma entirely. And even then, he will have to pass through the four-corps capture of Meiktila. So yeah, let's get to the Thunder Run. Now I'm putting the word Thunder Run on it. No one uses that term at the time. I've got it, and listeners will probably be aware of it really from the 2003 invasion of Iraq, because on a certain level, this is a very, very similar operation. There is one specific target. Like I said, don't worry about the flanks, and also the use of air power to resupply. In that case, the use of helicopters, for example. This is now about parachute drops and capturing airfields for resupply. So the Thunder Run leaves on the 21st of February 1945. So the The River Irrawaddy has been crossed, a bridgehead has been built up, and the 17th Indian Division and the 255th Indian Tank Brigade have gathered on the eastern side of the Irrawaddy, ready to break out for Meiktila, which is about 80 miles. It's one of those weird quirks of the maths here, is that Meiktila is about 80, 90 miles south of Mandalay. It's about 80, 90 miles east of the crossing of the Irrawaddy, like a right-angled triangle, where Meiktila is the right-angled corner. Mandalay is at the taller edge. Roughly. We roughly know where we're at. And so what you have then is he has to strike out quickly because they want to take Meiktila very, very fast. If they don't move quickly enough, they're worried about being bogged down, isolated, destroyed, because they want to capture airfields for two reasons. They want an airfield to bring in another infantry brigade because they're worried that bringing all three infantry brigades on this they won't have enough vehicles, but it's the biggest problem because they are begging and borrowing vehicles from all the other units as well. Units so I talked about the 5th Indian Division were on a Tiddim Road after Imphal, the 11th East African Division. When they're taken out of the line after they've got to the Chindwin, where do all their vehicles go? Well, they go back into the 17th Indian Division so they could do the Thunder Run because this is not the west of the European theatre. This is the Far East. They don't have enough vehicles to do combined arms manoeuvre operations for entire divisions in multiple different places at the same time because other divisions have also had vehicles, but compromises are being made. So they build up these two infantry brigades, but they need to capture airfields to bring in the 3rd Infantry Brigade and also potentially more because they have got contingency plans if they need it to fly in even more brigades because they've decided brigade is the size of unit they want to reinforce with at a time rather than whole divisions. Simply because, again, the logistics of keeping them supplied this far away from the railhead and so on, because there's constant logistical limitations on everything that they're planning. So capture all the airfields, got to do it quickly, don't want to get isolated where we will struggle to land enough supplies. Because, again, parachute dropping is fine, but after a week or so, you're going to need a much heavier resupply than just parachute drops. Not everything is going to survive the parachute drop. Certain things they don't want to. I mean, there's an amazing guy I wrote about where they watched a load of letters drop, and then someone drops a load of mortar bombs that then blow up when they land, and all the letters are gone everywhere, and all this sort of stuff. So there are things that will not survive the parachute jump, and they can't rely on that. They need the landing operations for resupply as well. So they don't want to get bogged down. So speed is of the essence. So Thunder Run is the point. So it has the tip of the Thunder Run is obviously the tanks with mechanized infantry, and then there are some logistical units behind them. But the crucial thing about it is, unlike, say, Hell's Highway and the attempt to get to Arnhem, there will not be a road kept open behind them. The Thunder Run is an island of 3,000 vehicles charging across the desert-like plain and then abandoning the Irrawaddy. There is no plan whatsoever to have a land-based resupply system at all. There is no conception of that. That is not the plan. Capture the airfields, one on the way for a quick resupply, but then when they get to Meiktila itself, because there is an airfield at Meiktila, they will capture that as well. And then they have to hold it against the Japanese counterattacks, destroy the Japanese over the following few weeks. And then once the Japanese are destroyed, basically when they break contact and the Mandalay operation has succeeded and crushed the Japanese as well, they will then have that easy ride to Rangoon, 400 miles further south. And so that's the plan of the Thunder.
How difficult was that fighting to capture the town?
So they only have one major engagement on the way on the Thunder Run, which they do clear in sort of about a 4 or 5 hour battle, which is pretty grim, actually. This is where they first...
Is that the Japanese not being able to react fast enough to put more road stops in?
Exactly that. Because the deception has worked very, very well. And there's more to that side of things as well. And the big thing about that first fight they have at a place called Oyin is they realise now that the Japanese suicidal tendencies have increased. So this is where they first come across the use of suicidal tank hunting, which will sound strange, but actually to a lot of listeners, they will assume that the idea of Japanese committing suicide to destroy a tank probably sounds like it happens more often. But remember, the point of a pole charge is that it doesn't kill the user. When a Japanese pole charge charges a tank, which you see in the Pacific, you see that a lot more. That is not designed to kill the user. It's just that the user often gets killed because of how physically close they have to get to a tank. This time, it's a little bit different. They experience for the first time Japanese soldiers that literally dive underneath a tank and then blow themselves up as a suicide bomber. which has not been seen before. So Japanese soldiers have done suicidal type attacks, but they have not done ones where they're deliberately intending to get themselves killed. And that's a big difference. And they first come across that at Oyen, and a lot of the troops who are not experienced troops, these are people who 2 years earlier were volunteering for the Indian Army, because they're Indian Army units, most of them. There's obviously a British battalion, but a lot of them are new recruits in the tank brigade, who is a big part of this battle. There is infantry that is more experienced. The 17th Indian Division is a very experienced division. By now, they fought the Japanese all the way since 1942. They're a proper phoenix from the flames division from the retreat in 1942 to the place they're at in 1945. And again, they're a reliable, aggressive unit. That's why they're doing this job. Now, a bit like Monty brings units with him for D-Day from 8th Army, doesn't he?
He don't want to be one of his favourite units because you never stop fighting.
Yeah, and to a degree, the 17th Indian Division is a bit like that, but there are fewer units to choose from. So there is an element of they're just the best unit to hand. To a degree, it doesn't mean they're literally the best unit, but they're best placed at that time. But Slim certainly likes them. They have to go through that. And then when they get to Meiktila, a lot of that suicidal attack still continues, but they all have commented on it. They comment on the increased intensity of the Japanese suicidal tendency when they make their attacks. They are pushing home attempts on tanks in particular. And the thing about Meiktila is a lot of listeners will think of a Japanese town or village perhaps as being like a wooden or bamboo huts and, sort of thatched roofs and things like that. Meiktila is a typical sort of European colonial semi-industrial supply hub. It's railways with, there's a marshalling yard. There's a lot of mechanical equipment there for repairing locomotives. So, there's those, where there's like big goods sheds. There's also vehicle transport goods shed. There's warehousing. And there are also sections of it have also got attractive colonial villas. Because it's in the central dry belt, it's not particularly attractive for the community of expatriates. If you're a European colonial in Meiktila, you're there because your job's there. You might work on the railways or whatever it is. But your family might live at somewhere like Maimyo, which is near Mandalay, which is cooler. It's on the sort of the edges of some hills, things like that. So Meiktila is this semi-industrial sort of area. So when they're fighting, it is, and I've slightly compared this before to, it was like if Stalingrad was in the desert, perhaps. Obviously not on the same scale, but the intensity is just as horrific. Again, it's room-to-room fighting. Soldiers talk about, it's 40 degrees, end of February, early March at Meiktila. So the actual fight for Meiktila town itself is 28th February to 3rd of March. It is street-to-street, room-to-room stuff. The Japanese are building bunkers in the basements of buildings. Tanks are having to, firing practically point-blank into the windows of basements to destroy the Japanese in there. The Japanese have done things like they're wheeling artillery, like anti-tank guns, into the ground floor of some of these larger buildings, and they're firing out of the windows, smashed windows, and that sort of thing. And again, suicidal attacks by the Japanese. This is more like what you expect. So there's a particular Victoria Cross that's done like that. That's one of these examples. So Naik Fazal Din. So Naik is like a corporal in the British Army. So Fazal Din is leading his section, 6, 8 guys, whatever it is. And what they're doing is they're going sort of amongst some bunkers in sort of a scrubby area around some sort of industrial buildings. And the Japanese basically do a suicide attack out of one of their bunkers. And there's a couple of officers with them. And Fazal Din basically gets stabbed through the chest with the guy's sword, the officer's sword. Now, the amazing thing, and this is where the Victoria Cross is, he wrestles the Japanese soldier off him. And by the way, the point of the sword is said to have come out of his back. It's in the Victoria Cross citation that it comes all the way through his uniform and out his back. He removes the sword from his body and then kills the Japanese officer with it. And then also rescues another friend, killing the Japanese soldier, attacking another one of his soldiers with the guy's sword. So he kills 2 people with the samurai sword. Not technically samurai sword, but yeah. But with the Japanese sword. I know sometimes I get picked up on that if I've said that before. It's not. But anyway, he kills the second Japanese soldier and then takes himself off as casualty and then dies the next morning of the internal bleeding. They can't evacuate him to a proper surgery. He needed proper surgery to survive that. And so he dies the next day. So it's a posthumous Victoria Cross. But it's just that incredible thing, removing a sword. It's from a film, like something from a film, removing a sword from your own body. But it's that kind of thing, the ferocity. I'm not saying this is unheard of, but it's to give you the idea of that intensity of of this fighting. And, it takes 3 days to clear this. And again, we are not talking a big European town. We are talking about something that's 3/4 of a mile across. This is not a large area. I mean, it's between two lakes, which is unhelpful. So there's only 3 real routes of advance into the thing. You're talking about someone like the size of Canterbury. It's a small city, large town, rather than an actual city. But really, really grim stuff. There's another Victoria Cross, William Weston. His men get shot at by a bunker. He charges the bunker and he's wounded as he approaches it. So he pulls a grenade off his webbing and then rolls himself inside and blows himself and the Japanese up. He's like some young 21-year-old. Fazaldin's a little bit older. He's, I think, 25. He's sort of an old Indian army. He's a regular. Weston is has come across his 21-year-old. Pretty much one of his first fights. And he gives his life for his men, basically. So that because he's already got to the bunker, and he doesn't know if he's going to live or die being wounded. So he just makes sure that no one else has to get hurt. Really amazing.
What struck me about this was once it's taken is we have these people talk about Slim and his defensive box kind of things. This must be the sort of culmination of that idea of defensive boxes because they're not. It struck me as adding the word defensive is a bit of a misnomer because they're not on the defensive once they take up a defensive position, are they?
Because remember, again, just to remind listeners, the whole point of capturing Meiktila is to make the Japanese come to you. So they are going to be surrounded. They know they're going to be surrounded from the moment they make the plans. The operation is designed to be surrounded by the Japanese. And remember, they're using the resupply on the airfield and parachute drops to keep going. But what they're doing is they do make those defensive boxes. They make 6 of them dotted around the town because they don't have enough to hold a continuous perimeter around the city or the airfield. Because again, the airfield is a big part of it. They form up their boxes, but then to keep the initiative, they use a mixture of aerial reconnaissance, local human intelligence, so they're interviewing locals, and their armoured car patrols and sometimes foot patrols, but armoured car patrols is better because it's a big open plain and speed is important to pinpoint where the Japanese reinforcements are coming from. Now, at the beginning of the battle, at this point, the commander of 15th Army up in the north of Katamuri, he's bringing 18th Division south, who had been fighting the Americans up at the Northern Combat Area Command in the far north of Burma. He's bringing them south because Meiktila is more important. And the 49th Japanese Division up from Rangoon. Now, they're a green division. They've never seen combat before, but they are available and pretty much intact. They're not full size. They're a slightly weaker division, but they are intact. Main thing is that 18th and 49th Division do outnumber Punch Cowan, the general in charge of the Thunder on Operation Meiktila and so on. He is outnumbered by them, but they come to him. But the Japanese have a doctrine where you never let your enemy settle. So you counterattack them as soon as you have troops available. So that does mean that they are sent in piecemeal. But with aerial reconnaissance, human intelligence and armoured car patrols, they know the Japanese are coming and they have advance warning. And so the whole plan for this phase of the battle is when they've identified a Japanese build-up, before the Japanese are ready to attack Cowan and the garrison, you send an armoured sweep out of one of your defensive boxes to destroy them, instead of waiting for them to come to your defensive box, which is what does happen at Imphal, Kohima and so on to a degree. The admin box, definitely. This is the opposite of that. The boxes are a little bit bigger and they've got, a squadron or 2 of tanks in each one that then goes out with mechanized infantry, self-propelled artillery. So these are 105mm Priest howitzers. They haven't got Sextons because they're all going to Europe. So they're using the American Lend-Lease stuff coming the other way. They're what's being used. They decided that that's what we've got available. We don't care about the fact it's not 25-pounders. We don't care about the different logistics because they have got 25-pounders and 5.5-inch mediums as well in the town because they bring artillery with them. But they want the mobile artillery for the sweeps because they go out and they identify the Japanese, they hammer them with self-propelled artillery and the tanks and the infantry then basically charge them. And this is the thing, like one of the guys I follow in Thunder Run, Miles Smeaton, like an amazing, amazing character. He talks about it like, I've used the phrase that he has his Scots Grey moment. So the great painting of the Scots Grey at Waterloo. He gets to charge across the desert, hallooing his men on, metaphorical sabre above his head. charging across to destroy the Japanese in the next village out in the plain, and they go as far as 20 miles away from Meiktila with these sweeps, and sometimes for 2 or 3 days at a time as well. They build a new defensive box 20 miles away. It's an amazing operation when you think about it.
Well, it's very aggressive for a defensive operation, if that makes sense. We think of these defensive boxes, and you think of them. I think they sort of get sold or remembered, because we don't remember so much about the Far East, as a defensive prop. Oh, if they got attacked, we could get in these boxes and we knew we could be resupplied by air. But actually the genius is, at this point, it's been refined, so the defensive boxes are very aggressive, offensive defensive boxes.
This is all part of sort of Slim Mesavie, the four-corps commander, and Cowan, the Johnny on the spot and the commander on the ground. This is all part of that plan. It helps them keep the initiative as well. Again, that thing about aggressive defense, offensive defense, you keep the initiative by doing this. You're never surprised by the Japanese because you're the one surprising them, but you're the one that's surrounded. That's what's so incredible about it. What I love about it. And you're saying about, everyone thinks of the defensive box of Imphal Kohima and so on. What's important to remember is that's what everyone remembers because they're so dramatic. But that shouldn't be the legacy of 14th Army or Slim. This actually, the whole thing, the deception of Mandalay versus Meiktila and the Gangor operation, the crossing of the Irrawaddy, the aggression of the Meiktila, and then the race to Rangoon that follows this. That's what Slim should be remembered for. I think about 15 years ago, the National Army Museum did the poll, and Rob Lyman, my co-host on the Forgotten War podcast, he rightly advocated and won that Slim was the greatest commander, and they won that poll as to who was the greatest commander in history. He's not doing it because of Imphal and Kohima on their own. Those battles are very, very brilliantly managed, but they are also battles to a degree of necessity. Well, the Japanese are surrounding you, so how else are you going to fight it? This one is a plan that he has to come up with in his own, and he forces Kimura to conform to it after initially retreating on it already. And it's made up on the fly in a couple of weeks, because remember, capital had to be scrapped and it becomes extended capital. I'm slightly simplifying that story there, but that's the ultimate point of it. And so that's how we should remember Slim for all of this stuff. It's this battle we should remember. And I feel like we've just done the end of the podcast, not the middle. That's the end of the podcast. We still haven't finished the battle. It's still going on at this point.
Is he essentially pinning down the Japanese almost to create a reverse siege so that he can siege the Japanese whilst aggressively as other forces come in?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the thing is that the other forces aren't coming in
very
initially.
Sophisticated.
It is
Yes.
incredibly sophisticated because, again, remember, he's destroying Kimura rather than taking territory. Hence the beauty of trapping them between Mandalay and Meiktila and then forcing the Japanese to come to him. Because in both cases, the Japanese need to retake both places if they want to survive. But Meiktila is the more important of the two because the Mandalay soldiers will fail to adapt to the lack of supplies if they don't recapture Meiktila. Either way, Slim gets his big army battle. Well, both of these things in conjunction are Slim's army-sized battle, the Clausewitzian strike, his Waterloo and all that. But down in Meiktila, that's the more sophisticated battle of the two. The Mandalay operation is a classic battle to take Mandalay and then drive south. Meiktila is about capturing a really important place and make the Japanese come to you so you can destroy them. Okay, so it's less straightforward than the Mandalay battle, which is a brilliant battle, something I'd maybe like to go to in the future to be a partner to this particular book. But that's I haven't got to that point yet. Cowan has now got to think about, as he's destroying the Japanese, I've still got to keep this going. And so what happens is, up at Mandalay, the commander of 15th Army, Katsumura, he realizes this isn't working. I've got too much on my plate with the Meiktila battle and the Mandalay battle. So the two divisional commanders that the sweeps are striking out at, and by the way, if anyone's read George MacDonald Fraser's Quartered Safe Out Here, he describes being on these sweeps, and I describe one of the ones he's on. I don't completely rely on MacDonald Fraser. I mean, he himself says that the dialogue in his book is basically made up. He's giving you the broad brush of this is basically what it was like, but it's an impressionist view of the dialogue that the soldiers had. And the broad conversations happened, but the dialogue is the best he can remember and bits filled in with what he thinks is most likely. But the actions he describes are generally pretty reliable, although he is also called out by some of his colleagues in the same company who then recorded for the IWM that he puts himself in the action a lot, in that he probably saw things at a slight distance rather than actually did them. maybe his section wasn't the one that did the thing. That sort of thing is the kind of criticism that he's had. So I've used him with caution, and it's a brilliant, brilliant book, don't get me wrong, and it really gives you a flavour of what it's like. There are just those little caveats. Doesn't mean he's an unreliable witness, unreliable dialogue, certainly. I didn't use any dialogue of his, but descriptions of things triangulated with other witnesses in the war diaries.
He needs a biographer like he's the biographer of Flashman to add subnotes to correct himself.
Yeah, in a strange way. Yeah, that would be an idea.
That's surreal.
Chronicling a chronicler, yeah. Those armoured sweeps are working fine, but the Japanese kind of get their act together in the second half of March. So Kimura now decides, because the 15th Army Commander's got too much on his plate, and the initial part of the battle has been too piecemeal. So the 18th Division and the 49th Division, the Japanese divisions attacking Meiktila, they both they're not really fighting together. One's fighting a battle above Meiktila and one's fighting to the south. They're not really coordinating. The other thing as well, 18th Division, the commander of 18th Division probably should have been in charge of the whole thing, a guy called Naka. He probably should have been in charge of the whole thing because he's also given all of 15th Army's artillery. So he's got 150 mil artillery, 105 mil artillery, and loads of 75s, more anti-tank guns. He's got a really, really hefty punch to him with these very, very reliable units. The Japanese artillery is very, very effective throughout the campaign, and they're very good at moving themselves. So they are quite well dispersed, and they move around every day, and they camouflage really well. So the sweeps struggle to pin down these artillery guns called Naganuma Force. The artillery is commanded by a guy called Naganuma. But because neither Naka is in charge nor the 49th Division commander is in charge directly, they're both just told to get on with it, but by their boss. But neither of them is senior, on paper at least, or officially according to the army commander. So they kind of never really communicate properly. The second half of March, that changes. So the 33rd Army Commander, Masaki Honda, he is brought south, and he is the one that actually then commands the second half of March. And this is the moment of the greatest tension, really, because he, again, thinking Clausewitzian, he concentrates on the airfield. Because the whole time this has been happening, obviously the British have been flying in supplies. Every single Japanese soldier can see these Dakotas landing or parachuting, depending on what the supply drop is and what it is being dropped. All day, every day, only in daylight. They don't bother to do night flying, even though they could have done. They chose not to. They felt like it wasn't worth the risk. So they only do daylight drops, but they see everything happening. So Honda's like, well, we've got to concentrate on the airfield. There have been support troops brought in, and one of them is the RAF regiment. Now, the RAF regiment today has Meiktila as one of its battle honours, and really they see the Meiktila as their coming-of-age story. This is the one where they prove their value, because every single morning, because they can't have a continuous perimeter of Meiktila and the airfield, or they can't even have either, and they can't have any contiguous perimeter, it's the RAF regiment who have to go out and do the patrols each morning to reopen the airfield. Because what does Honda send his troops to do every morning? Well, he sends them to infiltrate as jitter parties onto the airfield, digging in, putting in, foxholes across onto the runways, and putting themselves in places where they can shoot at the aircraft as they land. For example, a couple of Dakotas are wrecked on the airfield. One of them, there's a famous military medal is won because the orderly rescues all the wounded soldiers. It's literally lining up to take off. And then an anti-tank gun tears through one of the engines, and the undercarriage collapses to one side. It's a miracle it didn't catch fire, actually, but I suppose it's armour piercing, so it's not in the high explosive. But it was an anti-tank gun that had fired it. Literally, it's about to take off. So if it had waited a few seconds longer, it might have actually have done more damage. But the guy drags all of the wounded that were being evacuated off and wins a military medal under fire, because the Japanese then open fire with small arms as well on this aircraft, and he rescues the wounded. And so the Japanese now are getting to this point where they have to, or the RAF regiment go out onto the airfield, identify the Japanese. On some occasions, they can clear them themselves. But if the Japanese have brought in a particularly large force, which occasionally they do, a whole battalion, say, that they bring onto the airfield and dig in, they then call in basically another sweep. So a squadron of tanks maybe, and a battalion of infantry, from one of the nearby brigade boxes. And then they have to clear it like it's one of these sweeps, which might take all day. And there are times when they close the airfield for 2 or 3 days at a time, because they just can't get the Japanese off it and far away. You can't just clear them off the airfield. You've also got to stop them from firing at everything that lands. So it's not just as simple as clearing the airfield, it's the surrounding villages. And at the southern end in particular, there is a village And again, because they can't take territory, because the garrison's too small, they can't take that village and then make that home and stop the Japanese re-infiltrating. But the thing is that is helpful for the sweeps, because they want the Japanese to reoccupy somewhere they're familiar with, because they can go and attack it in roughly the same way. And the Japanese don't have the anti-tank guns or capability to fight off these sweeps, because remember, tanks are at the heart of it with infantry support. It's interesting that the tankers talk about this as a really, like, this is such a strange thing to say, because obviously there are casualties, people are killed in their tanks and so on, but they enjoy the battle in a way that the infantry don't, because it's fighting the Japanese. So you read tankers' accounts, or like there's a brilliant guy, I had a real stroke of luck with this book, a wonderful man called Nicky McClintock emailed me saying, look, I've got about 3 hours worth of video footage where I sat down with my father, who was a forward observer in a Sherman tank for the 59th Field Battery, which was the Priest self-propelled guns. And he talked about it like, I was charging around this desert and firing from the hip at the Japanese. And then, we charged into a village and Christ, the tanks buggered off. I had to take them on with my machine guns, but it was jolly good fun. And then he tailed off a bit like the guy from the Fast Show. And he goes, yeah, great fun, enormous fun. He was such a character, but he loved it. He had the time of his life on this. But then for the infantry, it's very different. Again, thinking of George MacDonald Fraser, some of the things they see in George MacDonald Fraser, and I recount this in the book because there are other witnesses that see this. Long John Petty, which is the guy that's like nearly 7 foot tall, that's the platoon commander in Fraser's platoon. He's stomping around. At one point, he bayonets a Japanese soldier and then bends his pig sticker on the number 4 Lee Enfield, bends the pig sticker, and then he can't get it out of the Japanese guy's body, and then has to fight off someone else that, another guy comes up. It's really, really grim stuff. And again, the street-to-street fighting at the beginning was grim. But if you're in a tank, it's very, very different, because the Japanese don't have effective weapons. Most of the tankers are unscathed. Certainly relative to, say, Normandy, being a tank man is relatively safe in Burma. Relatively. Not completely, but relatively.
You're also just probably more worried about failure. Because I presume with the tank, mechanical problems, which presumably the tanks are a finite resource. If you're cut off, you're not flying in tanks, so the tanks that they have are what they have.
Yes, yeah, and there is obviously wastage, and again they are not going to bring any forwards. There is no point. It's interesting, actually. In August 1944, Mountbatten orders some experiments to see if you could fly Sherman tanks disassembled in Dakotas. They can physically manage it, but they decide that it's not really worth the candle. About 3 weeks later, after they start the testing, the problem is that you have to have so many soldiers at the air base that's unloading and reassembling them, that you need to then have even more people there to guard those men, because their job is to build the things, not guard the perimeter and so on. It's just not worth it. You couldn't logistically sustain that airfield and do all the other things you expect them to do. So it's just like, no, that's just not worth pursuing. So they don't. But it shows you the creative thinking of Far East, and that they're thinking about how do they get tanks to do this sort of thing, knowing the success of those defensive boxes. Because Mandalay falls about 10 days before they break off Meiktila, the 20th Indian Division, who was basically the flank guard of the Mandalay operation, which is slightly simplifying their role, but is not completely unfair. They are the ones that then spearhead the drive 90 miles south to Mandalay. So they're the hammer that then falls on the Meiktila anvil. And they're the ones that actually reach the guys that were on the initial Thunder on first. It's not where they came from. It's not the guys on the Irrawaddy, 7th Indian Division and 4 Corps. It's actually 33rd Corps that link up with them first from the north, rather than to the sort of the northwest. 4 Corps, and they're relieved. And so the Japanese are sort of squeezed to the east and then south, but they are broken at this point.
How long had they held out for?
So the Thunder Run is the 21st of February when they leave. So that's the point where they go onto permanent air supply. And the Japanese break off on about the 28th, but there is still fighting. They're still on air supply really until the beginning of April. To be honest, they spend the whole time on air supply even after this, but they do eventually have a road link open to them by sort of the end of the first week of April, give or take. The first convoys are getting through, but then a permanent link, first week of April. So yeah, that's what, 6 weeks, 6 to 7 weeks.
It's a long time.
Very long time.
A lot of plane flights supplying tons and tons of stuff.
And that's really important because they do manage to have a lot of supply flights. And for that, they are rejigging a lot of the air supply. At one point in the beginning of the move down the Gangor Valley, Slim has them taken away. And then basically Mountbatten requisitions them, the Chinese. So it's worth saying, whilst it's going badly for the Japanese in Burma, they're in the middle of a really, really quite close-run battle where they really push the Japanese a long way back in the Ishigo offensive up in China. A real close-run thing for the Chinese. The Japanese get very close to success there. And that was why Chiang Kai-shek had demanded that planes go further north, and Mountbatten basically superseded that. And again, we don't want to get too much bogged into that because that's actually earlier in this. I mentioned it in the book, but again, it's not the main point. What I'm saying is that the main thing is Slim got his way. He got his battle because the best way to protect China and to keep supplies flowing was to get the Japanese out of Burma. And so they won that argument.
Well, I was just thinking, what's impressive is, you have a real all-arms battle where everything's used, air power. But what they managed to do is what the Germans sort of failed to do on the Eastern Front is bring enough fuel, because it's fuel. Tanks are not 30 miles to the gallon, are they? You need a lot of fuel to drive all the tanks and food, and it all comes in by air, and it keeps everything running. Why do you think it's not remembered? I mean, it seems to be sort of the pinnacle of achievements in all arms operations. Why is it not remembered?
Yeah, I mean, that's a bold claim I make on the cover of the book. I'm not going to lie, the greatest combined arms manoeuvre battle.
No, but I think you've made a decisive argument for it,
Yeah, I hope so. That is the intention, and I hope that's what people get when they read the book. That, like,
there is no one decisive, but everything has. But I certainly think it would. You could put it up there as a pinnacle of what one would look like.
Yeah. And also the other thing is, I say it's the greatest battle no one's ever heard of. That's the other thing about it.
that could be arguably true. Well, let's caveat possibly from the Anglo, British sort of perspective.
Every nation and culture will have its own version of that.
But why is it not remembered? Remember the Arakan, remember the Kohima. Why is Meiktila not up there?
There's a few different things. I mean, Britain does have a funny relationship with victory. Britain does love a victory, don't get me wrong, but we also really, really love a tragic failure or a close run thing. So Rorke's Drift, Kohima would be a classic example of those. We love Arnhem for that. I even put things like the first day of the Somme, another example. That's a huge thing, partly because of its tragedy. We don't remember the 100 Days Offensive, because I'd argue that
nope.
We don't remember that.
It's the greatest British victory of all time.
Yeah. Precisely. Yeah. You won't find me disagree with that. I even put things like the Titanic and the Great Escape under that category. We love the Titanic, and that's a tragedy. We love the Great Escape, which is really a tragedy. The murder of those 50 POWs, only 3 of them actually get to safety, all that stuff. So we do have a funny relationship with victory. I think there's partly that. We don't celebrate victories like that necessarily as well as we could do or should do. I think it's also tied up in thorny issues of empire and post-partition India, post-independence Burma and so on. These are countries that are looking to their futures, not looking to their pasts. Now, the Indian and Pakistani army both look back to things like Meiktila. So the two main tank regiments in the Meiktila operation, the Deccan Horse, are now in the Indian army, and Probyn's Horse are in the Pakistani army. They both look back on this battle, which is interesting because, you never know. There was a time where they could have faced off against each other. I think that's a big part of it. All of the issues about, the motivation of Indian soldiers, certainly the really bad history that's been written about the Indian National Army for nationalist India as well, controversial topic, but frankly, anyone who really studies the actual historical record is the INA are not any good. They're not a foundation myth of India. They're not. They are a foundation myth, but they're not actually a foundational in a literal sense, if you see what I mean. The other thing as well is that a lot of this takes place. The Battle of Meiktila is taking place. It begins before, but happens during the crossing of the Rhine, and then the invasion of Germany, and then the race to Rangoon, which kind of like we've not really said, but like the race to Rangoon, which immediately follows it because the Japanese are broken down there. Rangoon falls literally 5 days before the VE Day. No one's thinking about the Far East. And then it gets overshadowed by the fact of the atomic bombs as well. And if we're going to talk about overshadows, one of the reasons why the race to Rangoon works is not just that the Meiktila operation has broken the back of the Japanese in Burma, but also things like Operation Character, which is the SOE Force 136 operation, using thousands of locally raised Burmese hill tribes to ambush and harass every single Japanese soldier that's then retreating to Rangoon, which then is adding to the broken and demoralized nature of the Japanese. And some amazing things where they're ambushing a load of Japanese who are on the move, who then become stragglers, who then get overtaken by the tanks, who just thumb them to surrender further back. You get, for one of the few times, Japanese soldiers that just watch the British tanks go past. There must be other instances of it, but I'm not aware of relatively large-scale thing where Japanese soldiers actually don't fight to their death because at this point, because the morale is so broken. And that's what the Thunder Run has done to them. That's what the 1945 operation has done to them.
What came to mind when you mentioned that, I wonder if that's a Burma thing. If you think about the war against Japan, the Burma campaign is eclipsed in modern memory with the Pacific campaign. That may well be more bitter fighting to the end necessarily than the Burma campaign, where there's more troops involved in Burma than those Pacific campaigns. So maybe the army is broke and doing something different than, say, on those islands where they are enclaves. Yeah,
yes, and you're talking about, Iwo Jima, is it a couple of thousand, for example? Whereas there's 3 Japanese armies, which in the British is a corps, it's not equivalent to an army in Britain. It's a corps, but even so, there is no Japanese army on a single island, if you see what I mean. Spread over the Philippines, for example, is a bit different. But Okinawa is not an army, a Japanese army, a corps, that sort of thing. And so it's why, for example, the Battle of Imphal and Kohima is the biggest defeat in terms of numbers of the Japanese, because it's an army battle by the Japanese. It's a corps on corps battle, if you see what I mean. And so that kind of is why that's such an important battle, because don't get me wrong, without Imphal and Kohima and then Slim fighting through the monsoon to get to the Chindwin at the end of 1944, there is no 1945 reconquest liberation of Burma. But I think that's one of the things, is that decision by Slim is one of the most important in the Second World War, in all honesty, because there is no reconquest of Burma without choosing to fight through that monsoon. All of the stuff we've talked about after that, in terms of one single small decision, do I fight on or do I refit? That's one of those, that's a real sliding doors moment to what happens in 1945, because otherwise you're talking about a horrific fight through the Chin Hills, because before Meiktila happens, the Japanese take on 30,000 reinforcements. So what if those guys had arrived in the Chin Hills south of Imphal, and you're then fighting through a 4,000-foot mountain range covered in jungle to get the Japanese out? It's a very different battle to the combined arms maneuver warfare that happens on the Central Plain in the Thunder Run.
Well, what ifs? Thanks, Jack. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Folks, if you want to read more about the fighting in Burma in 1945, Jack's book is Thunder Run, Meiktila, 1945. I'll put a link on the website and in the show notes. I should have mentioned at the start, Jack now has his own podcast, hosted with the excellent Rob Lyman. It's called the Forgotten War Podcast, and is available on all the usual podcasts platforms. Do check it out. It's a really authoritative take on the war in the Far East. Well, that is all for this episode. If you'd like to support the show and get ad-free listening along with extra World War II chats when I have it, you can sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And a big thank you to those who already support the show. Your help really does make a difference. So once again, that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Next time, I think we'll be staying in the Far East. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.